The hallways of the Galactic Concordance Academy gleamed with an almost painful sterility. Surfaces reflected light in ways that suggested they were not merely clean, but actively repelling any microscopic intruders. It was a necessity in an institution hosting life forms from across the known universe, each with their own biological vulnerabilities and requirements. Alara Vance wiped her hands with an antibacterial cloth for the third time that morning before adjusting her datapad. As the only human exchange student specializing in xenobotanical engineering at the Academy, she had developed a routine that her alien classmates had come to recognize: meticulous cleaning before handling any shared equipment, wearing protective gear even in safe zones, and thoroughly washing plant specimens before analysis. From across the laboratory, 3 sets of very different sensory organs observed her ritual with varying degrees of curiosity and misinterpretation. Human specimen continues display of pathogen avoidance behaviors. Xyler's crystalline form refracted light as they updated their observation notes. The silicon-based entity prioritized absolute logic and purity, finding organic life simultaneously fascinating and faintly disturbing. Their faceted surface shifted subtly, recording data without the need for external devices. Pathogen fear index significantly elevated. Thar, a reptilian being with iridescent scales that underwent regular shedding cycles, visibly recoiled when Alara approached after returning from a soil sampling excursion. His forked tongue flicked nervously as he edged away from her. The human carries so many surface contaminants, he hissed softly to Xyler. How does she not disrupt her entire epidermal integrity? The third observer, Pinta, extended one of their 5 appendages in a gesture of empathetic concern. The multi-limbed empath could sense emotional states across species barriers, and Alara's consistent tension around potential contamination registered clearly. She exists in a constant state of anxiety. Pinta noted, their voice a melodic hum, always fearing invisible threats. How exhausting for her species. None of them had spoken these observations directly to Alara, but she was aware of their scrutiny. She'd grown accustomed to being a biological curiosity during her 10 months at the Academy, though she wished she could better explain that her precautions were simply standard human procedure, not manifestations of pathological fear. That afternoon found the 4 of them in the Advanced Organics Laboratory, working with volatile biological samples from a recently discovered moon. The specimens were housed in specially designed containment units, manipulated through robotic arms controlled by neural interfaces. Alara was carefully extracting compounds from a particularly promising fungal analog when a power fluctuation rippled through the system. The robotic arm she was controlling jerked unpredictably. Alara tried to compensate, but the movement was too sudden. The specimen container cracked, and a small but forceful explosion of pressurized gases sent shards of specialized glass flying. Alara felt a sharp, burning pain as a jagged fragment sliced deep into her forearm. She pulled back instinctively, her neural connection to the equipment severing as blood welled from the wound, dripping onto the pristine laboratory surface. The reaction from her alien classmates was immediate and extreme. Biological containment breach. Thar's voice rose to a panicked pitch as he backed away rapidly, nearly toppling a workstation in his haste. His scales flattened against his body, a clear sign of distress. Activate decontamination field now. Xyler moved with unexpected speed for a crystalline being, reaching for the emergency protocols panel. Quarantine procedures initiated. Biological contamination detected. Their normally placid tone carried an edge of urgency. Pinta swayed unsteadily, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of pain and shock emanating from Alara. The pain, so sharp, so exposed, they gasped, their empathic systems overloading with the intensity of human pain responses. The Academy's emergency protocols engaged automatically. Containment fields shimmered into existence, sealing the laboratory section. An automated voice announced, biological hazard detected. Medical drones dispatched. Please remain in position for assessment. Alara glanced at the wound, grimacing at the depth and steady flow of blood. She looked up at the status indicator on the wall. The medical drones would take at least 5 minutes to arrive due to the biohazard lockdown procedures requiring full systems checks before entry. I need to clean this wound, she said firmly, making a decision. Right now, her alien classmates watched as she reached for her personal field kit, a standard item for all Academy students regardless of species. They expected her to use an advanced sterile, sealant, or emergency freeze spray, temporary measures until proper medical intervention arrived. Instead, Alara pulled out a distinctly low-tech item, a standard bottle of isopropyl alcohol. She took a deep breath, bracing herself, and then poured the clear liquid directly onto her open, bleeding wound. The effect was instantaneous. Alara inhaled sharply through clenched teeth, her body going rigid as the alcohol made contact with exposed nerve endings. Her hand clenched involuntarily, knuckles whitening as she fought against the intense burning sensation. For a moment, she couldn't speak, could only endure as the disinfectant did its work. The reaction from her classmates was one of absolute horror. Xyler's crystalline surface pulsed with unusual patterns, their equivalent of extreme confusion. Subject is self-applying corrosive solvent to damaged tissue, they noted, voice modulations betraying their struggle to process the observation. Action contradicts established fear index. Logical inconsistency detected. Thar made a sound of visceral disgust, his scales rippling in revulsion. Self-inflicted chemical burning? To prevent. What exactly? The concept seemed entirely beyond his comprehension, his reptilian features contorted in what might have been his species' version of nausea. Pitt nearly collapsed, overwhelmed by the wave of pain they sensed from Alara. The pain? Why would you willingly embrace it? They asked weakly, their appendages drawing closer to their central mass in a protective gesture. Alara finally found her voice, gasping slightly as she pressed a sterile gauze pad against the wound. Better than letting it get infected, she managed to say through still clenched teeth. Seeing their continued incomprehension, she tried to explain further. It kills bacteria, harmful microorganisms that could enter the wound. She pressed the gauze more firmly, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. It hurts now, but prevents something much worse later. Her explanation seemed to only deepen their confusion. The concept she was describing, accepting immediate pain to prevent potential future harm, deliberately introducing a caustic chemical agent to damage tissue, conflicted with their understanding of biological risks, pain responses, and medical protocols. The medical drones finally arrived, entering the laboratory after the biohazard scans cleared them for entry. They efficiently took over Alara's care, cleaning the wound properly, applying advanced synthetic skin closures, and covering the area with a biotechnological bandage that would accelerate healing while preventing infection. But the incident was far from over in terms of its impact on the Academy community. Later that day, all students involved in the laboratory incident were required to attend a debriefing session led by Professor Zendri, an ancient, gaseous being contained within an articulated exosuit that allowed for physical interaction with solid matter. Professor Zendri had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations and maintained a calm, detached perspective on most matters. The incident presents an opportunity for cross-species understanding. The professor's voice emanated from the exosuit's communication array, the gas within the transparent cranial dome shifting in patterns that indicated thoughtful consideration. Each species responds to biological threats according to their evolutionary history and physiological requirements. The alien students presented their observations first, focusing on what they perceived as a contradiction in Alara's behavior. The human exhibits extreme caution regarding potential contamination, Xyler stated, projecting holographic data points showing Alara's consistent sanitizing behaviors. Yet when actually wounded, she applied a substance that caused significant additional pain and tissue irritation. The logical disconnect requires explanation. Thar spoke next, his tail twitching with residual discomfort at the memory. No species with functioning self-preservation would deliberately expose living tissue to such caustic agents, he insisted. It violates basic biological protection principles. Pinta, now recovered from their empathic overload, offered a more nuanced perspective. The pain experienced was genuine and intense, they confirmed. But there was also purpose, determination, not fear alone, but something more complex. Professor Zendri turned to Alara. Perhaps you could explain human medical response protocols for the benefit of your colleagues. Alara attempted to provide a deeper explanation of human immune systems, the history of antiseptics, the concept of calculated risk, and the importance of rapid intervention in some situations versus waiting for ideal conditions. Humans evolved on a planet teeming with microorganisms, she explained. Our bodies are essentially walking ecosystems, but some bacteria that enter wounds can multiply rapidly and cause infections that spread through the bloodstream. Before we developed modern medicine, many people died from simple wounds because of these infections. She held up the now empty alcohol bottle. This disinfectant kills harmful bacteria quickly. Yes, it causes pain and minor tissue damage, but that's significantly less dangerous than allowing pathogenic bacteria to multiply unchecked in an open wound. Her explanation, however logical to her, was filtered through the biological and cultural lenses of her alien classmates. Zyler struggled with what they perceived as the inefficiency of pain as a motivator, unable to reconcile deliberate self-harm with rational action. Thar could not comprehend willingly exposing living tissue to a chemical irritant, rather than immediately sealing it from all environmental contact. Pinta remained focused on what they perceived as unnecessary suffering. But the medical drones were coming, Pinta pointed out. Why not wait for proper treatment, rather than causing yourself additional pain? Because every minute matters when it comes to preventing infection, Alara replied. The longer bacteria have to enter and establish themselves in a wound, the harder they are to eliminate. It's a time-sensitive situation. Professor Zendri's gaseous form swirled thoughtfully. An interesting case of different evolutionary priorities, they observed. For some species, immediate isolation of any breach is paramount. For humans, it seems, aggressive elimination of potential pathogens takes precedence over tissue preservation or pain avoidance. The discussion continued, but Alara could tell that true understanding remained elusive. The gap between her instinctive knowledge about wound care and her classmates' fundamentally different biological imperatives was proving difficult to bridge. In the days that followed, Alara's recovery progressed quickly, but her alien classmates' confusion only seemed to deepen as they observed her continuing to push herself physically despite her injury. She modified laboratory equipment herself rather than waiting for technical assistance, participated in a zero-gravity plant harvesting exercise that required significant physical exertion, and generally behaved as if the wound were an inconvenience rather than a significant biological event. Zyler documented what they termed reckless disregard for recent tissue damage, while Kthar couldn't comprehend why Alara wouldn't enter a period of protected rest to ensure optimal healing. Pinta observed what they interpreted as Alara ignoring her body's distress signals. The confusion reached a new level when, during a data analysis session, Alara received a small paper cut from the edge of a physical data card. Without thinking, she briefly put her finger to her mouth, sucking away the tiny drop of blood before reaching for a sanitizing wipe. Kthar witnessed this and looked absolutely horrified. "Oral cavity contamination," he exclaimed, scales standing on end. "You deliberately introduced external contaminants into your digestive tract." Alara looked up, momentarily confused before realizing what had triggered his reaction. "Oh, that? It's just a tiny cut. It's almost instinctive for humans to do that with minor injuries." She shrugged. "Our saliva actually has some antimicrobial properties. You use oral secretions as a first-line treatment?" Zyler asked, their tone indicating they were updating their notes with this seemingly contradictory information. "Well, not for serious wounds, obviously," Alara clarified, realizing how strange the behavior must seem to them. just very minor ones. It's more of a reflexive action than a deliberate treatment. This explanation only seemed to add to their bewilderment, further cementing their impression that human biological responses were wildly inconsistent and potentially irrational. The opportunity for deeper understanding came 3 weeks later during what should have been a routine asteroid approach simulation. The Academy maintained a small captured asteroid in stable orbit for training purposes, allowing students to practice exploration and sampling techniques in actual low-gravity conditions. What began as a standard training exercise quickly evolved into a crisis when a structural support in the docking module failed, causing a cascade of system malfunctions. Among these was a breach in a controlled biological containment unit, releasing a carefully regulated biological agent used for experimental terraforming. The emergency response was immediate but complicated by the multiple simultaneous failures. Alara found herself part of the initial response team alongside Xyler and Kthar, while Penta coordinated empathic warning signals from a command position, helping to locate any injured personnel through their emotional distress signatures. As they navigated the compromised sections of the module, they encountered an injured student, a gaseous entity named Mevis, whose containment suit had been damaged in the chaos. Unlike Professor Zendry's more advanced exosuit, Mevis's equipment was standard student grade and significantly more vulnerable. The situation was dire. Mevis's gaseous form was beginning to disperse through a hairline fracture in their containment field, while simultaneously being contaminated by particles from the breached biological experiment. The combination was causing a dangerous reaction, with crystallization beginning to form within their gaseous matrix, a potentially fatal condition for their species. Standard procedure requires specialized emergency response units with calibrated field generators, Xyler stated, already transmitting distress codes to the Academy's central systems. Estimated arrival, 8 minutes, 43 seconds. Alara assessed Mevis's condition, noting the accelerating crystallization pattern. They don't have 8 minutes, she said grimly. Those crystals reach their core matrix. They'll experience complete phase disruption. Thar's tongue flicked anxiously. We cannot intervene without proper equipment. The protocols are clear. Alara looked around rapidly, her mind racing through possibilities. The standard sterile field generators weren't functioning due to the power fluctuations, and waiting for the specialized team wasn't an option. She needed to act now. Her gaze landed on her environmental suit's emergency repair kit. It wasn't designed for biological containment, but the principles were similar. Create a seal, prevent further contamination. I have an idea, she said, already moving toward Mevis. It's not by the book, but it might work. What are you planning? Xyler asked, their crystalline form shifting with concern. Alara was already extracting components from her repair kit, a patch sheet designed for suit breaches, a small canister of sealant foam, and a UV activator. None of these were rated for biological containment or medical use, but the fundamental purpose was the same: create a barrier between two environments. I'm going to seal the fracture in their containment field, she explained quickly, modifying the materials as she spoke. The patch sheet can be configured to match the electrical signature of their field if I revert it to its base state and recalibrate. That violates at least 7 safety protocols, Xyler objected. The materials haven't been sterilized for biological interaction, and the sealant chemicals could interact unpredictably with their gaseous composition. Kthar added, his voice rising with alarm. Alara didn't pause in her work. Yes, and waiting means certain dispersal. She looked up briefly. The contamination is already happening. This might cause some localized damage at the interface point, but it's better than complete matrix failure. Without waiting for further discussion, she moved decisively. Using the emergency tools in ways they weren't specifically designed for, she created a makeshift patch for Mevis's containment field. The process was messy by Academy standards, improvised, imperfect, and potentially introducing its own complications, but it addressed the immediate threat. Hold still, she instructed Mevis, whose communicator was emitting distress signals in their native frequency. This will stabilize you until the proper team arrives. As she applied the patch, Xyler continued to object to the procedural violations, while Kthar expressed disgust at the crude methods being employed. But Alara worked with focused determination, her movements quick and confident despite the unorthodox approach. Waiting would be worse, she stated firmly as she activated the patch. This will hold. The patch took effect immediately, sealing the fracture in Mevis's containment field and halting the dispersal of their gaseous form. The crystallization process slowed, though it didn't reverse. That would require specialized treatment. But the immediate threat to Mevis's existence had been addressed. 7 minutes later, the professional emergency response team arrived and took over. They transferred Mevis to a properly calibrated containment unit and began the process of purging the crystalline contaminants from their gaseous matrix. One of the technicians examined Alara's improvised patch with a mixture of surprise and grudging approval. Unorthodox, but effective for a field solution, they commented. You bought them crucial time. The aftermath of the incident brought significant attention to Alara's actions. The Academy's Safety Committee initially marked her intervention as a serious protocol violation, but the positive outcome and the specific circumstances, imminent threat, lack of viable alternatives, led to a reassessment. 3 days later, Professor Zendri convened a special session to discuss the incident and its implications. Mevis, now fully recovered, was present, their gaseous form swirling with patterns that their species used to indicate gratitude. The Academy values procedural precision and standardized responses, Professor Zendri began, as these ensure consistency across diverse biological requirements. However, this incident highlights the value of adaptive problem-solving in crisis situations. They turned toward Alara. Your approach, prioritizing immediate, imperfect action over waiting for ideal conditions, proved critical in this instance. Mevis's translator conveyed their perspective. In my culture, we have a concept called favorable dispersion, the acceptance that sometimes parts must be sacrificed to preserve the whole. The human's willingness to risk localized damage to prevent complete system failure aligns with this philosophy, though implemented very differently. Throughout the discussion, Alara noticed Xyler, Kthar, and Pinta exchanging glances. They seemed to be processing something, reassessing previous conclusions. After the session concluded, Xyler approached Alara in the corridor. Instead of offering their usual logical assessment, they surprised her by presenting a holographic display of historical Earth medical practices, battlefield triage, early antiseptic techniques, emergency first responder protocols. Analysis indicates that human biological history necessitates immediate, aggressive antimicrobial responses, often prioritizing pathogen elimination over tissue integrity or comfort. Xyler stated, their crystalline form reflecting light patterns that suggested deep processing. The fear is not of infection itself, but of the consequences of inaction. Alara smiled, feeling a breakthrough in understanding. That's actually quite accurate. We're not paranoid about contamination for its own sake. We're practical about preventing worse outcomes. Later that same week, Kthar observed Alara treating a minor scratch she'd received while working with gardening tools in the xenobotanical nursery. She simply wiped it with a disinfectant cloth rather than employing the dramatic alcohol pouring technique that had so disturbed him previously. Your method changes, but the intent, prevention, remains constant? He asked, his reptilian features showing genuine curiosity rather than the previous disgust. Alara nodded. Different wounds, different responses. It's about proportional action, using what's necessary for each specific situation. Like different shedding protocols for different environmental conditions, Kthar mused, referencing his own species' biological processes. Not fear, but adaptation. Perhaps the most meaningful interaction came when Pinta approached Alara while she was working late in the laboratory. The empath had been notably distant since the alcohol incident, overwhelmed by the intensity of the pain they had sensed. I have been recalibrating my understanding, Pinta said, their melodic voice thoughtful. You accept discomfort to protect the whole. The self is part of the whole. Alara looked up from her work, surprised by the insight. That's a beautiful way of putting it, she acknowledged. Sometimes a little pain, now, prevents much greater suffering later. Pinta extended an appendage in what Alara had come to recognize as a gesture of connection. Our approaches differ, but perhaps our purposes align more than I realized. Protection takes many forms. In the days that followed, Alara noticed subtle but significant changes in her interactions with her alien classmates. They still observed her human behaviors with curiosity, but the sense of bewilderment and judgment had been replaced with a more nuanced appreciation. Differences remained, profound biological and cultural gaps that couldn't be completely bridged, but respect had taken root where confusion once dominated. One evening, as the Academy's artificial lights cycle dimmed to simulate night, Alara found herself in a xenobotanical greenhouse, tending to a small collection of earth plants thriving under alien spectrum lights. She carefully pruned a resilient basil plant, its familiar scent a comforting reminder of home. She became aware of presences behind her and turned to find Xyler, Thar, and Pinta observing her work. Their postures held none of the wariness of their early interactions, instead reflecting thoughtful contemplation. Earth plants require regular wound-inducing maintenance, Xyler observed, watching as Alara trimmed the basil. Yet they respond with increased growth. Sometimes systems become stronger through controlled stress, Alara replied, smiling slightly at the parallel. It's not so different from how some crystalline structures strengthen under pressure. Thar moved closer, his scales now relaxed rather than bristling with discomfort. Your species and your plants, adaptable through damage and recovery. A different path to resilience than my kind's regeneration cycles, but effective in its own way. Pinta's appendages swayed gently, sensing the peaceful emotions in the greenhouse. There is harmony in discovering different paths to similar ends, they noted. Connection through understanding our differences, not despite them. As Alara continued working with her earth plants, surrounded by classmates who had moved from judging her alien behaviors to appreciating their underlying purpose, she felt less isolated than she had since arriving at the Academy. They saw her not just as an anomalous human, but as a being whose biological imperatives, however different from their own, made sense within her evolutionary context. The plants continued their quiet, persistent growth under unfamiliar lights, adapting and thriving despite the alien environment, much like Alara herself. And around her, her classmates observed with new understanding, their initial assumptions transformed through experience into something more complex and valuable. Respect for different kinds of resilience. In that moment of quiet comprehension, surrounded by life forms from across the galaxy, Alara felt that she had finally begun to fulfill the true purpose of the exchange program. Not just to study alien life, but to help others understand what it meant to be human.